My mother stood in front of 40 relatives at my cousin's wedding and told them I had disappeared 4 years ago. She said it with tears in her eyes, dabbing a tissue like she was the victim. My aunt hugged her and whispered, "Some children just forget where they came from." What none of them knew was that I was standing 40 feet away, holding a glass of champagne, watching my own funeral being performed while I was still breathing. I wasn't missing, I wasn't dead. I had simply stopped being their personal ATM, and for that, they erased me and rewrote the story where I was the villain. That night, I didn't cry. I smiled, walked over, and said one sentence that made my mother drop her champagne glass on the marble floor. If you've ever been the reliable one in your family, the one who gives and gives until you're hollow, stay with me. Because what happened next is the reason I'm sharing this story. Subscribe now because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how quiet, legal, devastating revenge really works. My name is Emily Carter, and this is my story. I grew up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, in a modest brick house with a leaky roof and a driveway that always needed repaving. My father, Richard, worked at a manufacturing plant for almost 30 years. My mother, Diane, stayed home when we were young, then worked part-time at a pharmacy once my brother and I were in school. We weren't rich, but we weren't desperate either. We were the kind of family that clipped coupons and still managed a vacation to the Smoky Mountains every couple of summers. I have one sibling, my younger brother Kyle, 2 years behind me, and from the moment I can remember, the household had an invisible rule book that nobody ever said out loud, but everyone followed. I was the responsible one. Kyle was the baby, the charmer, the one who could do no wrong. When I got a B on a test, my father would ask, "What happened?" When Kyle got a C, my mother would say he was just more of a big picture thinker. I didn't resent him for it back then. Honestly, I loved my little brother. I used to help him with his homework, cover for him when he snuck out, and once even took the blame for a dent in my dad's truck that Kyle put there riding his bike, too, close to the garage. I thought that's what older siblings did. I thought loyalty was supposed to be one-directional, flowing from me outward, and that eventually it would come back around. I was wrong, but it took me 26 years to understand. How wrong? I got a partial scholarship to Ohio State for accounting, and I worked 2 jobs through college to cover the rest, a coffee shop in the mornings and a tutoring center in the evenings. My parents helped where they could, but money was always tight, especially once Kyle started finding himself, which was the polite family term for dropping out of community college twice and bouncing between odd jobs that never lasted more than a few months. I graduated with honors, landed an entry-level position at a mid-sized financial firm in Columbus, and within 3 years worked my way up to a senior financial analyst role. I was proud. I finally felt like the sacrifices meant something. And then my father lost his job. Plant he'd worked at for almost 3 decades did a round of layoffs, and at 58, with a bad knee and no college degree, he wasn't exactly a hot commodity in the job market. My mother's part-time pharmacy job barely covered groceries. The mortgage on the house, the one they'd refinanced twice over the years, mostly to help pay off Kyle's car, and a business opportunity that turned out to be a multi-level marketing scheme, was suddenly at risk. I remember the phone call. My mother's voice, shaking, asking, if I could help out for a few months, just until your father finds something. Of course, I said yes. What kind of daughter says no to that? I started sending $800 a month. Then it became $1,000. Then, when my father's unemployment ran out and he still hadn't found steady work, it became $1,500 a month. Almost a third of my take-home pay at the time. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself family helps family. I moved into a smaller apartment, gave up my gym membership, stopped taking the vacations my coworkers bragged about on Monday mornings, and I sent that check home every single month like clockwork for 4 years. During those 4 years, Kyle never contributed a single dollar. Not once. He was living at home rent-free the entire time, working sporadically at a car dealership, spending most of his money on a truck he couldn't afford and a girlfriend he was trying to impress. Every time I brought it up, gently, carefully, because I didn't want to start a fight, my mother would say the same thing. Kyle is still figuring things out. You're stable. You understand responsibility. We need you right now. I understand responsibility. That phrase became a leash they used to pull me back every time I hesitated. I started missing things. Missed my best friend's bachelorette weekend because I couldn't afford the flight after sending money home that month. I missed out on a downtown apartment I really wanted because my savings account never grew past a few $1,000s, no matter how hard I worked. I turned down a job offer in Chicago that would have paid 40% more because it would have meant a gap of 2 months before my first paycheck, and my parents couldn't manage that kind of uncertainty. I want to be clear about something. I'm not telling you this because I regret helping my parents when my father lost his job. That part, I'd do again. What I regret is not asking the question that should have been obvious from day one. Why was I the only one being asked to sacrifice? The answer came to me slowly, in pieces, the way truth usually does when you're not ready to see it. It started with small comments at family dinners. My Aunt Carol mentioned, almost in passing, that Kyle had just put a down payment on a new truck. A nicer one than the one he'd traded in. I remember doing quiet math in my head. Kyle didn't have a full-time job at that point. Where was that money coming from? A few months later, my cousin Rachel let something slip at a birthday party, thinking I already knew. She mentioned that my parents had taken out a home equity line of credit to help Kyle get back on his feet, and that part of it had gone toward his truck, and another part toward paying off a credit card he'd maxed out on things I won't even list because it was embarrassing how frivolous it was. I asked my mother about it directly that same week. She got defensive immediately, which told me everything. She said the loan was family business and that I wouldn't understand the pressure of being a parent. I asked how they were affording the payments on that loan, on top of everything else, on top of the $1,500 I was sending every single month. She didn't answer. She changed the subject to asking when I was going to settle down and give her grandchildren, which, in my family, was always the go-to deflection whenever a real question got too close to an uncomfortable truth. That night, I went home and I couldn't sleep. I started pulling old bank statements, not because I suspected anything specific, yet just because something in my gut told me I needed to understand where my money was actually going. What I found didn't add up cleanly, but it planted a seed of doubt that never fully went away again. Over the next year, that seed grew into something impossible to ignore. I noticed my credit score had dropped without explanation. I pulled my credit report, expecting maybe a billing error, and found an auto loan I had never signed for, listed under my name, financed through a dealership I had never walked into. My hands were shaking as I read the details. The loan was for a truck, Kyle's truck. I called the number on the report. Immediately, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The dealership finance manager confirmed the loan had been opened using my social security number, my date of birth, and a signature that, when I finally saw a copy of it, was clearly not mine, though someone had tried to make it look close. I asked when the loan was opened. 3 years earlier. 3 years of monthly payments I never knew about, some of which had apparently been missed, which explained the mysterious drop in my credit score that I'd chalked up to a system error and ignored, because I trusted my family more than I trusted the numbers in front of me. I sat on my kitchen floor that night, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a little girl. Not because of the money, though the money mattered. I cried because I finally understood what had actually been happening for years. I wasn't the responsible daughter holding the family together. I was the resource being quietly, systematically drained while my brother lived comfortably on money that included funds fraudulently taken out in my name, and my parents either orchestrated it or looked the other way while it happened, which honestly felt just as bad. I confronted them. I drove home unannounced on a Saturday, documents in hand, and I sat my parents down at the same kitchen table where I'd done my homework as a kid. I laid out the credit report. I laid out the loan documents. I asked calmly, though my voice was trembling, who had done this. My father wouldn't look at me. My mother cried immediately, the same performative crying I would later recognize at that wedding, and said it was just supposed to be temporary, and that they were going to tell me eventually, once they had the money to make it right. Kyle, when I called him, laughed. He actually laughed and said, "Relax, Em. It's not like you are using your credit for anything. You never even buy anything nice for yourself." That sentence replayed in my head for weeks afterward. It's not like you were using your credit for anything. As if my financial identity was simply an unused resource, sitting idle, available for anyone in the family to borrow without asking, because I was too responsible, too boring, too predictable to have plans of my own that required good credit. I stopped sending money that month. I told them I needed time to process what had happened, and that the loan needed to be paid off or transferred out of my name immediately, or I would be forced to report it. My mother accused me of abandoning the family in their darkest hour. My father said I was being dramatic over a misunderstanding. Kyle stopped speaking to me entirely, as if I was the one who had wronged him. This was my lowest point, and I want to be honest with you about how bad it actually got. I was working full-time, trying to untangle a fraudulent loan, trying to protect what was left of my credit, and doing it almost entirely alone because the moment I stopped being useful financially, my family's warmth toward me evaporated overnight. I developed insomnia. I lost weight I didn't need to lose. I started having panic attacks in my car in the office parking garage before work, sitting there for 10, sometimes 15 minutes, just trying to breathe normally before walking inside and pretending everything was fine. My performance at work started slipping. Not dramatically, but enough that my manager noticed and asked if everything was okay at home. I told her yes, because admitting the truth felt like admitting that my entire family, the people who were supposed to protect me most, had turned me into collateral damage for my brother's comfort. The worst part wasn't even the financial betrayal. It was the loneliness of it. I called my Aunt Carol, hoping for some kind of validation, some acknowledgement that what happened to me was wrong. And instead she said, "Family is complicated, honey. Maybe just let it go for peace's sake." Peace, apparently, meant staying quiet and letting myself be exploited indefinitely. I remember standing in my apartment one night, staring at the loan documents spread across my coffee table, and thinking, for the first time in my life, that maybe the version of me who kept giving, kept forgiving, kept explaining herself, had to die so a different version of me could survive. That was the turning point. Not a dramatic movie moment, no music swelling in the background, just me, exhausted, sitting alone at 11 at night, deciding that I was done being quietly destroyed, to keep everyone else comfortable. I didn't want to burn my family down out of anger. I wanted something smarter. I wanted the truth. Documented, undeniable, and permanent, because I had learned that in my family, feelings could always be argued away, but paperwork could not. The first thing I did was hire an attorney who specialized in identity theft and family financial fraud. A woman named Patricia Nguyen who, within our first consultation, told me something I'll never forget. She said, "This happens more than people realize. Family identity theft is one of the hardest kinds to prosecute because victims feel too guilty to report it. You're not going to be one of those victims who stays quiet. I filed a formal police report documenting the unauthorized loan, providing the credit report, the loan documents, and a handwriting sample comparison that clearly showed the signature on the auto loan did not match mine. Patricia helped me file a fraud alert and dispute with all 3 credit bureaus, which began the process of legally removing the fraudulent account from my credit history. Separately, I contacted the dealership's finance department directly, in writing, formally notifying them that the loan had been obtained fraudulently using my identity without consent and requesting all further collection activity be redirected while the matter was investigated. This wasn't about destroying my parents financially out of spite. This was about protecting myself, legally, completely, and making sure the truth existed somewhere that couldn't be gaslit away at a kitchen table. While that process was underway, I quietly started rebuilding my own life. I applied for that Chicago job again, the one I'd turned down years earlier, and to my surprise, the opportunity was still open, because apparently they'd never fully filled the role. I interviewed, got the offer, and this time, there was no one to ask permission from. I gave notice at my job in Columbus, packed up my apartment, and moved to Chicago within 6 weeks. For the first time in 4 years, my income was entirely mine. No $1,500 disappearing every month. No mysterious loan payments I didn't know about. Just my paycheck, my savings account actually growing, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling that I slowly identified as peace. My parents called constantly during those first few months, alternating between guilt trips and outright anger. My mother left a voicemail saying I was punishing them for one mistake and that she didn't recognize who I'd become. I didn't return most of those calls. Patricia had advised me to keep communication minimal and, when necessary, in writing, so there would always be a clear record. It was during this quiet period, almost a year after I moved, that I found out what they'd been telling people. My cousin Rachel, the same one who'd accidentally tipped me off about the loan years earlier, called me out of the blue. She said she wanted to give me a heads up before my cousin's wedding, since I was invited and she assumed I'd be attending. She said hesitantly, "Emily, I don't know if you know this, but your mom's been telling everyone you disappeared. Like, cut off contact completely, wouldn't say why, wouldn't answer calls. Some people think something happened to you. Aunt Carol thinks you might be struggling with something serious, like a breakdown." I sat there in stunned silence. Disappeared. Not, we had a falling out because they stole my identity to fund my brother's truck. Not, our daughter finally set a boundary after we betrayed her trust for years. Disappeared, framed just vaguely enough to make me the mystery, the tragedy, possibly even the unstable one, while they remain the sympathetic parents left behind, worrying about their poor, troubled daughter. It was honestly almost impressive in its cruelty. They hadn't just erased the truth. They had rewritten me into a cautionary tale, all while continuing to live comfortably in a house that was still, in part, financed by a loan illegally taken out in my name that I was still in the process of legally clearing. That's when I made a decision. I was going to that wedding. Not to cause a scene, not to scream or cry or beg for an apology. I was going to walk, in exactly as I was, successful, calm, and financially independent, and I was going to let the truth speak for itself, at the exact moment it would be most impossible to ignore. Patricia, when I told her my plan, actually laughed and said, "That's the best kind of revenge there is. You don't even have to raise your voice." I flew back to Columbus for the wedding, wearing a simple emerald green dress I'd bought with my own money from my own paycheck, feeling more like myself than I had in years. I brought one folder with me, tucked discreetly into my purse, containing Copies of the credit bureau resolution letter confirming the fraudulent loan had been officially removed from my credit report and legally reassigned, along with the police report number. I wasn't planning to hand it out like party favors. I just wanted it there, in case the moment called for it. The wedding was beautiful, held at a country club just outside the city, string lights strung across. The reception hall, the kind of event my family always loved because it gave them a stage. I mingled quietly at first, catching curious, almost cautious glances from relatives who clearly didn't know what to say to the daughter who had disappeared. Then came the toasts. My mother, radiant in a navy blue dress, took the microphone during a lull between speeches, ostensibly to say something sweet about the bride, my cousin, but she veered, as she always did, into making the moment about herself. She talked about family, about how precious it was, about how you never know when someone might just walk away from you without warning. Her voice cracked, right on cue. She said, and I remember this word for word because I will never forget it. Some of you know our daughter Emily hasn't been part of our lives for a while now. We don't know exactly why. One day, she just stopped answering, stopped calling, disappeared on us. It's been the hardest thing we've ever gone through as parents. The room went quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when everyone suddenly remembers something uncomfortable. People turned, searching, and then found me, standing near the back by the champagne table. Very much not disappeared. Very much alive, watching my own mother perform grief for an audience while I stood 40 feet away holding a drink. I could have stayed silent. Could have let the awkwardness pass and slipped out quietly. But 4 years of being erased, exploited, and rewritten had built something in me that finally refused to stay small. I walked forward calmly, and I asked if I could say something too, since apparently my absence had already been part of the program. My mother's face went white. I took the microphone, and I looked at the room full of people who had spent a year believing I'd vanished into thin air, and I said, gently but clearly, that I hadn't disappeared at all. I said I'd actually been quite easy to find at my new job in Chicago, at the same phone number I'd had for over a decade, and that I'd stopped answering calls from my parents specifically after discovering that they had allowed my identity to be used to fraudulently finance my brother's truck, a debt I'd been unknowingly paying down for years before I found out. I said I had documentation, from the police, from all 3 credit bureaus, confirming the fraud, in case anyone wanted to understand why I'd needed some space. I didn't yell, didn't cry. I said it the way you'd read a weather report, and somehow that made it land even harder. The silence afterward was the loudest thing I've ever experienced. My mother tried to laugh it off, saying I was exaggerating and always did have a flair for drama. But Rachel, standing near the front, said loudly enough for people to hear, "Wait, is that why your credit score tanked a few years ago, Emily? I remember you mentioning something back then." And just like that, other pieces started clicking into place for people who had clearly been fed a very different narrative for a very long time. My father tried to pull me aside, whispering that I was ruining your cousin's wedding, and I told him, calmly, that I wasn't the one who brought up my disappearance during a wedding toast in the first place. Kyle, red-faced, stormed over and hissed that I was embarrassing the family, and I looked at him and said the sentence I mentioned earlier, the one that made my mother drop her champagne glass on the marble floor. I said, "The only thing more embarrassing than a fraud investigation is finding out your golden boy status was built on stolen credit." The glass shattered. Champagne and glass scattered across the floor near her heels, and in that moment, the entire fabricated story they'd maintained for over a year, the missing daughter, the tragic mystery, the concerned parents, collapsed completely, in front of the very audience they'd built it for. I didn't stay much longer after that. I hugged the bride, wished her genuine happiness, and left before things could spiral into a full-blown scene, because that was never my goal. My goal was truth, delivered calmly, at the moment it would matter most, and I'd accomplished exactly that. The aftermath moved faster than I expected. Word spread through the extended family within days. Aunt Carol called me, this time with an actual apology, saying she wished she'd asked more questions years earlier instead of telling me to let it go for peace's sake. Rachel became, unexpectedly, one of my closest allies, helping fill in gaps of what had been said in family group chats I'd been quietly removed from without my knowledge. Chats where my parents had, for over a year, painted increasingly dramatic versions of my disappearance to keep sympathy flowing their way. My parents' reputation within the family took a hit they never fully recovered from, not because I sought to destroy them publicly, but because the truth simply didn't need my help to be damaging once it was finally out. Legally, the matter had already been resolved months before the wedding, with the fraudulent loan permanently removed from my credit history and the dealership adjusting their records once the fraud was confirmed and documented through the police report. Chose not to pursue further legal action against my parents directly, not out of forgiveness exactly, but because I had already spent enough of my life and energy on them, and pressing charges against your own mother and father, even when justified, comes with a cost that I decided wasn't worth paying twice. My revenge was never going to be a courtroom, it was going to be my life, lived fully, without them controlling any part of it. Kyle, interestingly, was the one who faced the most immediate real-world consequences. His girlfriend, who happened to be at the wedding and heard everything unfold, apparently had already been, quietly wondering how Kyle afforded that truck on his sporadic income. She ended their relationship within a month, and from what Rachel told me later, Kyle finally got a full-time, stable job for the first time in his adult life, mostly because the safety net of family money and misplaced credit had finally run out. I won't pretend I felt sympathy for him in that moment. I felt something closer to relief, the recognition that consequences, real ones, sometimes have to happen before people change. As for me, life in Chicago kept moving forward in ways that felt, for the first time in years, entirely my own. I got promoted 8 months after the wedding to senior manager, overseeing a small team, doing work I was genuinely proud of. I started therapy, which I'd resisted for years out of some misplaced idea that needing help meant I was weak, when really it turned out to be one of the most important decisions I ever made for myself. My therapist helped me understand something that took me a long time to accept, which was that being the responsible one in a family isn't actually a compliment. Sometimes it's a role assigned to the person least likely to push back. And the people who assign it aren't rewarding your strength, they're relying on your silence. I built a new circle of friends in Chicago, people who knew nothing about my family history, who simply knew me as Emily, sharp, funny, a little guarded, but warming up more each year, someone who showed up for people because she wanted to, not because she felt obligated to. I started dating someone eventually. A man named David who worked in software development, and who, on our third date, when I finally told him a condensed version of what happened with my family, said something that stuck with me. He said, "The fact that you can tell that story without falling apart tells me you already did the hardest part of healing before I even met you." My parents reached out a handful of times over the following 2 years, usually around holidays, usually with messages that hovered somewhere between guilt and quiet hope for reconciliation. I responded to some, ignored others, and slowly, on my own terms, decided what kind of relationship, if any, made sense going forward. We're not close. I don't think we ever will be again. Not in the way people imagine family should be, but I no longer carry the anger the way I used to. I simply carry the truth. And the truth, it turns out, is a much lighter thing to hold than resentment ever was. Looking back now, 3 years after, that wedding, I think about all the versions of myself I could have stayed as. The daughter who kept sending money because saying no felt unthinkable. The sister who stayed quiet because confrontation felt disloyal. The woman who found out about a fraudulent loan and, out of fear of family conflict, might have simply paid it off quietly and never said a word, letting herself be erased twice, once financially, and once from the family narrative entirely. I could have been any of those women. I'm grateful, every single day, that I chose to become someone else instead. Someone who understood that love without boundaries isn't love. It's just exploitation wearing a familiar face. Someone who learned that silence protects abusers far more often than it protects families. Someone who realized that the most powerful revenge isn't loud or cruel or even particularly dramatic. It's simply living well, telling the truth clearly when the moment calls for it, and refusing to disappear quietly just because disappearing would have been more convenient for everyone else. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this to take away from my story, it's this. You are allowed to stop giving to people who only value you for what you provide. You are allowed to ask questions, even uncomfortable ones, especially about money. Especially within families that treat financial silence as some kind of virtue. And if you ever find yourself being erased from your own story to protect someone else's image, remember that the truth doesn't disappear just because someone stops saying it out loud. It waits, patiently, for the moment you're finally ready to say it yourself. And when that moment comes, you don't need to scream. You just need to stand there, calm and unmistakably present, and let the truth do what it does best. Thank you for listening to my story. If it moved you, made you angry, or reminded you of your own family, let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if you believe in quiet, legal, undeniable justice, make sure you're subscribed because there are so many more stories like mine still waiting to be told.